So, Cleo, you've alerted me to yet another US border, one that I just simply didn't know existed, that's being, I guess, penetrated by, in this case, the Chinese communist regime.
Completely legally. This is astounding. But there is a part of the United States where Chinese can arrive without a visa. Absolutely without a visa. Just get on a plane, get on a direct flight, and get off in the United States. And that is in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. This is where the United States borders Japan. If you know where Guam is 3,000 miles to the west of Hawaii. Guam, which is also part of the U.S., is west of Darwin, Australia. It's about 1,500 miles from Taiwan, about the same from Okinawa. And the Marianas are contiguous to that. They're north. So Guam is the southern Mariana Island. It's its own thing. But this Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is about 14 islands, is directly north of that. And that's part of the United States. It's been part of the United States since about 1986. American citizens, American territory. And for a whole bunch of different reasons, Chinese can arrive without a visa. And some come for tourism, but quite a few have been involved in proven nefarious activity, including using the U.S. Postal Service for distributing drugs, buying U.S. passports. There has been legal but problematic birth tourism, seemingly purchasing marriages with American citizens. But the biggest strategic threat has been illegally crossing, because once they get to Marianas, they're not supposed to go to the rest of the U.S., but hundreds, at least, have been taking boats and going to Guam. And some have been found roaming around U.S. military bases in Guam. There's one other angle to this, which is they've also been linked to casinos in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas that at one point were running more money than the casinos in Macau. Billions, huge amounts of money. So this is this open back door into the United States that is a huge security concern, and the governor of the Marianas would like to see it closed. It's in the remit of the Department of Homeland to do so. Members of Congress have written asking for that to happen, but it has yet to happen.
Well, and the really interesting thing is that they seem to have stopped the same practice for Russians, but they haven't stopped it for Chinese, which is extremely odd.
Yeah, I mean, this was a part of the U.S. where both Russians and Chinese had visa exemptions, and they did stop it for the Russians, but they've kept it going for the Chinese. And there's been a lot of push from the Chamber of Commerce to keep it going. They're saying it's essential for their tourism sector, even though now the majority of the tourists come from Korea. And there are very likely specific business interests involved. Some very important families are linked quite closely back to mainland China, operating in CNMI. This casino thing brought a ton of money and political influence into the country. There have been 3 major casinos. There was one on the island of Tinian, which got shut down. There was one in Saipan, which is the main island, which has been shut down, but the license hasn't been fully revoked yet. But now there's a new one on the harbor in Tinian. And Tinian, to give an idea of how important historically and strategically and geographically this location is, Tinian was the site of one of the busiest airports in the world in 1945, because that's once the Americans had captured CNMI, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, which includes Saipan and Tinian from Japan. That's where the waves of the B-29 bombers were taking off from to bomb mainland Japan. They were in range at that point. And the U.S. is now rehabilitating those runways, putting in about $400 million to redo the runways on Tinian. But at the same time, there's this Chinese-linked casino right on the dual-use harbor with the ability to see what's coming and going, and through political warfare, through injecting money, getting political influence, perhaps being able to undercut those U.S. kinetic investments.
Well, so here's the thing that we should talk about, right? This area of the world is incredibly important for U.S. security, right? And we, not too long ago, we had Grant Newsham on the show talking about the fact that the Compact Treaty had not been funded, and this was, would be a massive blow to the U.S. security posture. And in general, we've had you on the show before talking about this, how important these tiny island chains, which seem, if you're not thinking about it carefully, almost inconsequential if you're focused on, mainland U.S. politics, is where the reality is they're incredibly important. So I want you to kind of frame that for us again. Yeah.
Yeah. So we often lump all the Pacific Islands together. The Pacific. So it's about 1/5 of the planet, and it's the buffer between Asia and the Americas. So when we're talking about the Pacific Islands, it could be the Solomon Islands, which would be sort of the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is down by Australia. It could be French Polynesia, which is French, and which is kind of down by sort of Chile, kind of down there. The part that is the most important to the United States, which is why the U.S. has maintained these relationships, are the ones in the north of the equator, across the center, bridging Hawaii to the Philippines. As long as there is the potential for conflict between Asia and the Americas, the way to physically get from one location to the other is through this zone. Any Taiwan contingency, resupplying of Japan, resupplying of South Korea, that all requires this zone being secure for the U.S. So, of course, China has been putting enormous effort to make sure that it becomes less and less secure for the U.S.
Well, so one of the things that, we've been discussing offline a little bit is how modern technology and modern warfare techniques, notably the CCP's unrestricted warfare doctrine, has kind of erased that distance to some degree. I believe that comes from Colonel Newsham's congressional testimony. The question is, are these places really that important in a modern age? And I think some people don't see their importance anymore, or at least it seems that way.
Yeah. So it depends on what battlefield you're looking at, whether you're looking at a kinetic battlefield or whether you're looking at sort of a political warfare battlefield, which has kinetic elements to it. But to overlay what you're talking about, this erasure of distance, which Colonel Newsham talked about in his congressional testimony, since the founding of the U.S., George Washington himself spoke about the United States' detached and distant situation. The idea in a lot of strategic planners' minds in the U.S. is isolationism is a viable choice. You can be isolated. And that's often the debate you have. Should we get involved in something or not? And that debate is predicated on the assumption that that choice is your gift, that you can be isolated. That distance has been erased. It's been erased through cyber. So the Chinese can disable the grid in a way that previously it would have taken a bomber hitting a transformer to do. It's been erased through chemical warfare with fentanyl, for example, killing more Americans in a year than died in the Vietnam War. And the Chinese fentanyl has killed, by a factor of 4 or 5, more Americans than Russians have killed Ukrainians. Right? The amount of Americans that have been killed through this deliberate chemical warfare, it's a very deliberate attack, and each death destroys a family.
I just want to mention, we've covered on recent shows with Peter Schweitzer, for example, how that actually works, like how it's very clear that this is Chinese Communist Party strategy, and not, we don't have much to do with that, right? Because that's always, of course, what they would say.
Well, the select committee just came out with that report that says that they're actually subsidizing. They're giving tax concessions to the chemical factories that produce the precursors.
Right.
And that's not for some domestic, pharmaceutical consumption. Right? And drug warfare is one of the 24 warfares listed in unrestricted warfare. And And it can work in both ways. It can be drugs that are used to kill you, like fentanyl, but it can also be gaining control of drug supply chains,
Right.
pharmaceutical supply chains, to have that lever over you, as we saw during COVID.
Right.
And COVID, of course, is another way where distance was erased. And regardless of where it came from, they blocked the flights from Wuhan to the rest of China, and they let the flights go to the rest of the world.
Cleo, we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back.
No young person having a safe place to sleep at night, or a warm meal to eat, or whether anyone cares about them.
Democracies. So, perfect opportunity we've talked about comprehensive national power on this show before. I want to get back to that, actually, because you really...
Yeah.
Panda in your zoo, then you are helping China project a positive, soft, cuddly image of China, and you are part of that kind of soft power expansion. But it's also, if you have lithium deposits, you might think that's part of your comprehensive national power, but if those lithium deposits are being extracted by a Chinese company and going back to China, that's part of their comprehensive national power. If your democracy is being eroded or being questioned, that hurts you and that helps China, because fundamentally it's a competition of systems. So it's extremely, extremely comprehensive, and it's relative. So if China's goal is to be number one, you can do it two ways. One, you can get better. The other is you knock the other guy down. And even if you get knocked down, if the other guy gets knocked down more, you've won. So that's why if you have an epidemic in your country and you think you might get hurt by it, in a comprehensive national power logic, you want everybody else to get hurt even more. So you turn your epidemic into a global pandemic, and you use those few weeks, especially slowing down the WHO on human-to-human transmission and things like that, to position yourself to be in a better comprehensive national power relative position when the rest of the world gets hit even more.
So I want to talk for the remainder of our time about the importance to U.S. security of both Taiwan, the quote-unquote unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? And I'll get you to explain that to me too. But just kind of to summarize, right? The Taiwan and these other islands in the Pacific that you have spent so much time understanding and watching how to use, the term from your detailed paper on this, Chinese island hopping, I think is the term you use. Just explain to me the importance of that and how that is being threatened.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So Taiwan is often reduced to, it's just the chips or that kind of thing. But there are two.
Wait, the chips are important.
Yeah, the chips are fine. The chips are important. However, I would argue, based on my understanding of comprehensive national power, that China is willing to damage everybody if everybody else is damaged a bit more than it is. Right? So if the chip factories are destroyed, that means nobody's getting the chips. So China won't get the chips, but neither will everybody else. And I'm undoubtedly, there's second level chips that they think that they've cornered the market on, or this or that, whatever, but you can't think of it in terms of logic, or it's not our logic. It's a completely different logic. I have a bit of a different opinion on this, on the demographic. China does have demographic issues, but they're not stupid. They knew that 30 years of one-child policy was going to create these demographic issues. And I think that at some level, the planners thought, okay, well, then we'll go through this bump, then we'll have all these old people, it'll be unbalanced, and then they'll die off, and then, we'll have a reduced general population. That's, I think they include the death of tens of millions of people in calculations in a way that
would be unthinkable.
Yeah. So I think that, applying, that's why I try to understand as much as I can of the Chinese terminology and logic or comprehensive national power industry war for that sort of thing. Taiwan creates two other big problems for China. One One is this existential issue of their legitimacy, the Chinese Communist Party, saying, well, the Chinese can't handle democracy. And then you look across the strait and you've got Han Chinese that are doing way better and have created a much more vibrant society and economy than the ones that have been living under communist rule. So it undermines the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And, the other...
And they've already, gotten rid of one partial democracy, which was also thriving for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which goes to that, which feeds into that other chip thing, which is people are like, oh, they'll never kill the golden goose that's Hong Kong. Oh, well, they did.
That's right.
So it's the logic is different. So you've got, if you're Chinese Communist Party, your legitimacy rests on a few things. One is your system is better, so the success of the U.S. is a threat to that. Han Chinese can't handle democracy. Well, Taiwan takes care of that. You need authoritarianism if it's a country of 1 billion people. Well, India takes care of that, which is another reason why India is another big target for them. So that's one reason why Taiwan is a problem. The other is geography, because yes, there's been this erasure of distance for hitting the U.S., but you still have trade routes and you still have, sort of the other, and kinetic, and if you look at the way they're building up the Navy, they clearly think that maritime domain is one that needs to be dominated. And if you're standing on the Chinese coast and looking out, what you see is what's known as the first island chain, which is the sort of set of islands off the coast, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. And it's actually very difficult to get, for example, your submarines out unobserved, to fly your jets out, to project power, which is, I think, probably one of the reasons why they've been militarizing the islands in the South China Sea, because that pushes them further closer off the coast towards the first island chain. If you can break Taiwan, if you can take Taiwan, then you've broken the first island chain and you're out into the Pacific, which takes you to the Arctic, which takes you down into the Indian Ocean. So from a strategic perspective, breaking that chain is very important. The islands, the Pacific Islands, through political warfare, so there are two different battlefields, right? There's the kinetic, and this Taiwan, that Taiwan piece is very much kinetic.
Well, if I might add, though, but they've invested a ton into the political warfare side as well, right? They've taken over media. There's this demoralization. There's demoralization.
Yeah.
There's been these constant overflights, the persistent threat.
Yeah.
There's all of this, right?
That's right, and that's why. And I should specify that, first of all, political warfare doesn't mean nobody dies. Right? I mean, I would argue that fentanyl is part of political warfare, and you've got tens of thousands dead. The other is, I think, and unrestricted warfare it's a continuum. It's political warfare, kinetic. It flows back and forth, and if the goal is to be number one in terms of comprehensive national power, a component of that is military. So you want to be in a position to be able to break the first island chain and project power from Taiwan. How you do that might be, ideally in their perspective, political warfare, not because it's more moral or legal, but because it's below the response threshold, the trigger threshold. So it has a lower cost. So the term island hopping is a strategy that was developed by the U.S. military during World War II. So you had the Japanese all over these islands. And the question was, do we take every single island? And the response was no, we're going to hop over some of them. We're going to take critical ones, and that might leave isolated Japanese outposts that would then have their logistics cut off. But it means that they would be much more weak when we finally do come, or they would surrender or whatever. So it wouldn't be we have to flood the zone. It's we're going to figure out how to hop through the region in order to be able to accomplish what we need to do, which is get closer and closer and closer to Japan to be in striking range. And this was based actually on work done by a Marine in the early 20s who saw the way Japan was emplacing itself throughout the Pacific Islands. A guy called Pete Ellis, who died in Palau actually in the early 20s, who wrote this very important treatise about these Micronesian bases. And undoubtedly, Toshio Ishihara has written about how the PLA has studied U.S. and Japanese emplacement in the Pacific Islands leading up to and during World War II. And you can see that China is, through political warfare, island hopping. It is grabbing strategic locations, in some cases, location like Canton Island in Kiribati, where there is an old U.S. airfield from World War II. You see it in the Solomon Islands in Guadalcanal. They're using political warfare to embed in a way that has kinetic potential, that is reminiscent of what the U.S. had to do kinetically during World War II. So what this means is that they've hopped the first island chain. They're already embedding all over the zone, including in ports and port infrastructure, but also corrupting political systems. So if the U.S. does try to get across the Pacific, or thinks it needs to get across the Pacific again, it's going to find it much, much more difficult.
Well, Cleo Pascal, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you again for having me. Really appreciate it. Good to see you.
Thank you all for joining Cleo Pascal and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellick.